Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. I hope you are well. I wanted to do a video discussing the most important topic of our time. That is personal freedom, liberty, and limiting the size, the power of the federal government and not allowing them to continue to micromanage our lives. It's it's not just important. That's not even articulating it half as well as I should. This is priority number one, without a doubt. We see what's happening right now across the entire globe, but more specifically in places in the West where we never thought that what we would see or what we're seeing now would actually occur. That places like Australia have quite literally turned into a totalitarian police state right in front of our eyes. And regardless of whether you think the rationale for them, instituting martial law is correct or not, the bottom line is the Australian people are giving the government there power that the government will never give back. And that even if you're in favor of we'll call them restrictions to be kind, at some point in time, the government will use the power and control that you're giving them now against you and your family. You see, that's what people that are in favor of mandates, government issued mandates, and government issued restrictions, that's what they don't understand. They see things as though it's just a snapshot in time. And we're either going to have to deal with what we're dealing with today, or the only other option is things go back to the way they were in 2019. They don't even consider what could happen if we never go back to 2019. They never consider what if we're on the road to serfdom? What if this totalitarian police state that I see all around me in New South Wales, Australia, what if it's permanent? What if it doesn't go away? See, these people are just completely oblivious. It's like they're whistling by the graveyard, and they just have not studied history. And they think that the government could only be benevolent and have the true intentions or the greater good, quote unquote, as their number one priority. And if they were to study history, they would see that more times than not, the government, regardless of how benevolent they seem, if you give them enough power and control, they will take it to an extreme. And again, they will use it against you and your family, regardless of what your belief system is regarding the cerveza sickness. It goes back to that old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. To illustrate my point, I want to go back in time to Stalinist Russia and something called the Great Purge. I want to just go over a few paragraphs, understand it a little bit better, and then apply it to what we could be seeing today, and therefore what we may see in the future, to really highlight how important fighting, figuratively, standing up, or maybe that's a better way to say it so I don't get in trouble with you too. Instead of fighting for freedom, we'll say how important standing up for freedom is right now. That yes, safety is important, but valuing freedom is even more important at the end of the day. Let's dive into the first article from history.com. And it talks about this Great Purge that Stalin implemented when he was trying to take more and more control. And actually, you know what? Before we go here, let's go over to a tweet that I sent out the other day. And this, I want to give full credit to Jordan Peterson. I was watching a critique he did on the Communist the Communist Manifesto from Marx, and he put things and articulated them in a way that I thought made made the point very clear about what happens when a government has too much power and they create a boogeyman, or they try to set up the world as though it's completely binary. And if you're on this side, then you're a good guy. If you're on that side, you are a bad guy. And how that leads to very, very bad consequences at the end of the day. So he pointed out that Marx looked at the world through the lens of a binary class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. All the good in the world was attributed to one of the groups, and all the bad in the world was attributed to the other group. And it's something that I'm going to circle back to, because I see that playing out today right in front of our eyes, not only in Australia and other areas of the world, but unfortunately right here in the United States. So going back to the Great Purge, Stalin used terms such as fifth column, enemy of the people, and saboteur to describe those who were sought out during the Great Purge. So basically, anyone that Stalin categorized as someone who wasn't fully committed to not only communism, but the Stalinist version of communism, where of course he was the dictator. They not only needed to be purged, but most often they needed to be murdered. The killing and imprisonment started with members of the Bolshevik Party. Those were the revolutionaries in the first place. Political officials and military members. Then the purge expanded to the peasants, ethnic minorities, artists, scientists, intellectuals, writers, foreigners, and ordinary citizens. Essentially, no one was safe from danger. You see, and this illustrates the first point I was trying to make, that even if you are someone right now that favors these government restrictions and mandates, that would be like one of the, let's say, peasants being in favor initially of the purge, because it only affects political officials and people in the military class, saying, yes, I agree with the purge. It's good. We need to make sure that anyone who isn't fully committed to this communist agenda is put in prison. Maybe they didn't know at the time they were murdering them. It probably didn't make it public. But yes, we should put them away. We should put them in a labor camp. We should isolate them. We should point them out. And we should show that they are the root of all of our problems. If you are not for us, you are against us. But you see, what that peasant didn't understand is that if you give Stalin that type of power, and if you don't stand up for each individual's freedom, including the military members, Bolsheviks, and the political officials, sooner or later, Stalin is going to come after you. And that's the important message that I want to make sure all of those people that are in favor of mandates and government restrictions, I want to make sure they understand that message. I want to make sure that is loud and clear, because this is a message that we see repeated throughout history. Whenever you give a centralized government too much power and control. Let's go ahead and move on to some, actually, this was an interesting book that was written by Orlando, I'm guessing his name is Figs or Figes. I'm not sure. We'll call him Orlando Figs. I'm sorry, Orlando, if I'm mispronouncing your name. But he is a professor at Birkbeck College of the University of London, relied heavily on oral history to gather intimate stories of moral degradation and humiliation suffered during Stalin's purges. In the 1930s, millions of Russians were deemed to be opponents of Stalin's regime and dispatched to labor camps, exiled to remote settlements, or executed. The author also enlisted teams of researchers who conducted thousands of interviews with Gulag survivors and their families, collected letters, memoirs, and other documents. So this was personal, intimate stories from people who literally experienced the horrors of what happened during Stalinist Russia, and said a better way, what happened when the people gave the government too much power. Private life in communist Russia, he says, reduced people to a breed of whisperers. People scared to give full voice to doubts or dissidents. Do we see that happening today? What happens if you are a dissenting voice and you have an unpopular opinion, or an opinion that is contrary to the prevailing narrative, and you go on social media? Or what happens if someone at your job finds out that you are opposed to XYZ restriction? Well, the chances are you're going to get fired very, very quick. Now, you might not be sent to a gulag, but you could completely lose your ability to provide for yourself and your family. Should that not, or does that not invoke fear in all of these college professors, as another example, who are afraid to stand up for something they believe in, or just even stand up for the free market of ideas? You know, they're in this category as well, where they're watching every single thing that they say. Same thing we saw during Stalinist Russia. So people, again, were scared to give full voice to doubts or dissidents, and whispering dark secrets behind the backs of neighbors, friends, and even family. Stalin regime relied heavily on mutual surveillance. So that's basically brainwashing people to believe that their job was to tell the government if they suspected their neighbor of believing in something so evil as private property rights. Something similar we see today, where you could imagine, especially in states like California and New York, that neighbors would want to inform the local authorities or governments if people valued freedom more than safety. Let's keep moving on here. So families were reporting each other, not just their neighbors, in communal living spaces, and reported quote unquote disloyalty. Many people did what they could to survive, but they dealt with shame and guilt long after Stalin's reign. So I'm not saying that what is happening today in the United States is this extreme. But what I am saying is we are obviously on the path. I don't think that's hyperbolic at all. Just look at the trajectory that we have been on since 2019, as far as government taking more and more of our freedom and usurping more and more power and control and micromanagement of your daily life. If we continue on this trajectory for the next 5 years, is it outlandish to say that we may find ourselves in the exact same position? Maybe they won't be executing people. I'm not saying that. But don't you think that we'll be just as divisive? That neighbors will be tattling on their neighbors who they feel aren't committed to the greater good, quote unquote? We'll be doxing these people. They'll be losing their jobs. They'll be losing their livelihood. Maybe they're deemed a domestic terrorist. and they don't deserve to have a bank account. They don't deserve to get a home loan. I mean, you can see it going this direction very quickly. And this is why I think it's so important that we have a sense of urgency right now to make sure that we stand up for freedom, to never allow it to get to that point. So now let me give you an example of what we're seeing right now in the media, which I think is very consistent with probably how these purges started in Stalinist Russia. I mean, let's just for a moment try to put ourselves back during that time. It's doubtful that these purges just happened immediately overnight, or or how extreme the purges were just was elevated to this level just within a week's time. They probably started out in a very mild way. You could see just in that article I read, it starts off with the military folks, the Bolsheviks, the political people, but then as time goes on, a year, 2 years, 3 years passes, that net that's being cast is grabbing more and more people to the point where everyone is included and everyone is deemed to be a traitor or potentially disloyal. So it happens slowly. It's just like boiling the frog. You don't do it all at once, just very, very slowly, and the frog doesn't realize that it's being cooked. Just like the people, you take away their freedom very slowly, and they never realize that it's being lost. So here's an article from the Atlantic. Stop calling it a, well, you guys can read it here. I want to keep this, we got to keep this YouTube friendly. But sure, and so initially you're saying, okay, great, maybe this person is standing up for freedom, but you would be wrong. The next sentence is, sure, it may be true, but that doesn't mean it's productive. So, you know, this is about as extreme an opinion as you can have right now, and not be fired, I think, especially if you're in the mainstream media. But what I want to do here is, let me read this paragraph or a couple paragraphs, and then I want to replace the words that Joe Biden has said with something that may make it a little easier to connect the environment now with what the environment was at the beginning of this Great Purge in Stalinist Russia. So let me try this out. So here is a quote, and I'll read the first couple paragraphs here. Your refusal, and this is Joe Biden to all the people who have not taken the medicine. It's actually very hard to watch what I say so much. I'm constantly thinking of the words I'm using to make sure that this doesn't get taken off of YouTube. But let's keep moving here. President Joe Biden said to the people who have refused the medicine last week, as he announced a new cerveza sickness mandate for all workers at private companies with more than 100 employees. We've all heard this story. The people who have chosen to take the medicine or have been forced to take the medicine, he said, are angry and frustrated with the nearly 80 million people who still haven't received the medicine. And their patience is wearing thin. The author goes on to say, he's not wrong about that. For people who understand that widespread medicine is our best strategy for beating this cerveza sickness. And right there, the author's wrong, because that's not a strategy. You're not going to beat this for a variety of reasons that I won't go into right now. But the 25% of Americans who still haven't received the medicine are a barrier to freedom. Their exasperation is warranted. Okay, so you guys got it. let's go back and use some different terminology that, again, might help us make that connection and see how this could resemble what may have been said back in Stalinist Russia at the beginning, when it was rather mild, of this Great Purge. Your refusal has cost us all, President Joe Biden said to the people who don't believe in communism last week, as he announced a new communist plan for all workers at private companies with more than 100 employees. The Communist Party and my fellow communists, he said, are angry and frustrated with the nearly 800 million people who still believe in private property rights and freedom. And the communists and my fellow Bolsheviks, our patience is wearing thin. And the author says, he's not wrong about that. For people who understand that widespread communism is our best strategy for improving the standard of living in society, the 25% of the Russian people who still believe in private property rights are a barrier to us achieving our socialist utopia and workers' paradise. I think that's a better way to say it, and that's a way that we can connect the dots and see how dangerous this slippery slope that we are on right now actually is.